Hello AS, welcome to your next flip learning, which is your observations. So hopefully you've accessed this through the solar pack. If you haven't and you've gone through the gone straight onto the YouTube channel, please go back to the student portal and click on the link that will be called observation solar pack, probably observation flip learning, and then from there you need to click on the link to the video, because that way you will get your register mark. If you don't do that, you will not get a mark, so please make sure you do it that way. Okay, this is your second to last topic that you will look at before half term. There is one more topic after that, which is self-report, and then there are two topics after, and then you have completely finished research methods, and it will be merely a recapping through and using it throughout the whole year. Just so you're aware, on your exams you could be asked about research methods at any point. So you could be writing about, you look at memory, you look at attachment, you look at social influence, so you could be talking about Milgram's study into obedience, and they could ask you about research methods. So make sure you are fully prepared, always aware of research methods. All students' favourite topics, and the one they're all really keen to talk about. Observation, there are certain terms you need to know. Behavioural categories. So behavioural categories are essentially just what we would call coding categories. So they are categories that where you note down, describe certain behaviours that you want to note down. These are in observations. So examples would be things like, if we were looking at aggression in a child, they'd be kicking, punching, throwing toys. There will be particular categories that you mark. It's unlikely you'll be asked to describe a behavioural category. What is very likely, and it has happened in the past, is that you will be asked to suggest some behavioural categories. Okay. Operationalizing a behavioural category, you must make it specific. So you must directly state what the behavioural category is. It can't be open to interpretation. So it couldn't be happy. If you're looking at happiness, it couldn't be being happy or being sad, because they can look like lots of different things. So what I would want you to think about is, what does a happy person look like? What behaviours would you expect to see? Well, you'd expect to see a smile, you'd expect to see the eyes crinkle. You want to think about all those things, so you must be specific. If you're looking at aggression, you can't just say being angry, because that is not good enough. You need to talk about specific actual behaviours. That's really important. Okay, and then event and time sampling. We're going to come to these. These are two different ways of conducting observations. Event sampling is tallying every time you see an event. Every time you observe a behavioural category, someone smile, you tally. Every time you see another behavioural category, somebody crying, you tally. Time sampling is when you pick a certain period of time and record all the behaviour that you observe in that time. So you might have 2-hour footage of video, you haven't got time to watch it all, so you watch every 5 minutes. You look at 5 minutes every 15 minutes. So every 20 minutes there'll be 5 minutes of footage that you observe. Don't panic if you're not too sure about that one. We will go over that. You are actually going to do some time and event sampling at home in this video. Okay. The first thing I would like you to do, so we're going to create some behavioural categories, and what I would like you to do, looking at these pictures, I have given you the behaviour of happiness. Using these pictures, I'd like you to pause the video, and I would like you to write down as many behaviours, so actual physical things that you would see, that you would consider behaviours that a happy person would display. Please do this. The amount of students that do not correctly operationalize behavioural categories the first time is very obvious, and I'm going to ask you to do that. One of the first things I'm going to ask you to do in class is to operationalize certain behavioural categories. So if you aren't able to do this, it becomes very clear that you haven't had practice. I know you're all excellent and very hardworking, so you will pause the video now and look at those behaviours and tell me, if I said operationalize happiness, behavioural categories, what would you be looking for in a person? Okay. So hopefully you've restarted the video again after making your list. An example here, and this is an excellent TV program, sort of based on a true life character, although not directly. We don't run around, as you will know from psychology now, we don't run around and solve crimes, but it is something that we look at. We look at micro expressions. So the basic concept of something called Lie to Me, which used to be on Netflix, but I don't think it is anymore, is the idea of micro expressions. So hopefully some of the things that you mentioned was smiling, because they've not mentioned that, so raising the corners of your mouth. You could mention the wrinkling of your crow's feet, your cheeks pushing up. You could, if you're talking about this guy again, you've got thumbs up, you've got head slightly tilted back, you've got eyes slightly shut. Any of those things, you only needed to think of 3. Were they behaviours? So not emotions, but actual behaviours. Same thing now with this emotion, which is sadness. Look at these pictures and just think of what people look like when they generally look sad, and tell me what kind of behaviours, what kind of behavioural categories could you use. So pause the video here. Okay, so sadness, you've got a pulling down of the lips, so your lips curve downwards, so that's something you could tally. You could lose focus in the eyes and drooping of the upper eyelids. Other things you've got more extreme behaviours, obviously, are looking down, placing your hands in your head, crying. Of course, some of these will overlap with other behaviours, but it's in the exam it's more important to operationalise. Next behaviour. Have a look at this behaviour. What do you think? So pause the video and write as many behavioural categories as you can think of. Okay, so you've got the eyebrows come down and together, so the middle of your nose wrinkles. Your eyes have got a glare to them. Now, I personally would still consider that not fully operationalised, but you could talk about them glaring. They narrow, don't they? You narrow your eyes, you pull your eyebrows down, you narrow, you purse your lips, you clench your hands, you put your hands on your hips, you frown, you bring your eyebrows in. Any of those things that you can think of. And final one, have a look at these pictures, pause the video. This one is fear. What different facial expressions are you seeing here? Okay, so these images are from a haunted house. They had a camera in there and people took pictures of them. So they are genuine pictures of people jumping and being afraid. And I can't remember where the other pictures come from, but they look quite authentic too. Fear, so you've got eyebrows raised up and pulled together. So with anger, it's down. Eyebrows are pulled up and raised together. Your eyelids are raised. Your eyes are open wide. You've got talked about tense lower lids. I won't worry too much about that. And lips are stretched back. So lips are stretched back. You can see teeth. Mouths are open, grabbing other people, wrinkling your eyes up again, turning away from the thing that's scary, opening eyes wide. Any of those things, not emotions, behaviours. So you've had a practice of that. What I'd like you to do now, same thing, is in your books again. So there's 2 activities you should have just written down in your books about those behaviours. Now what I would like you to do is think responses to a violent film. Would the following categories be well operationalised behavioural categories? So would the following behaviours be well operationalised behavioural categories? And we're going to go over these in class. So yes or no, and why. So suggest an alternative if you don't think, or could they be, they're good but they could be improved, operationalised more. Screaming, placing hands over eyes, horror, widening of eyes, disgust, laughter, sadness, crying. Are they actual behaviours that you can observe, or are they emotions? If they're emotions, they're no good. You need to give me specific behaviours that can be observed. And another thing that another one I'd like you to have a go at is I would like you to list your own behaviours for behavioural categories for engaged student. If I looked up when I was teaching a class and I wanted to work out who was engaged and who wasn't, what kind of behavioural categories would I be looking for if I wanted to see a student who was enjoying the session, who was really engaged in the activity I'd just given them? Or if someone was sat in the corner, how could they identify, if you're struggling with that, how could they identify behaviours of a student who is disengaged, who is bored, who is not interested? And can you tell me, would thinking be an appropriate behavioural category? No, because thinking is something you cannot observe. How do we know what does somebody look like when they think? So what does a person look like? Okay. Right, on to event and time sampling. Event sampling, you record every time an event or behaviour happens. So every time a child cries, you tally it. Every time a child hits someone. Time sampling is recording what happens at a set time. So every 30 seconds, you pause the video and you record what is happening. Or every 30 seconds, you look up and you write down what is happening. There is also a new term, inter-rater reliability, and that's a way of testing reliability. This is on the A2 spec, so you don't have to know it for AS, but inter-rater reliability is where you observe, you get two observers to rate the same behaviours, so the same video footage, they watch the same thing happening at the same time, and then independently, so sat away from each other, they tally the behaviours, or they note down every behaviour that's happening every 30 seconds. Then they compare the behaviours. If they are similar, we can be confident the results are high in reliability. If they are not similar, then we know the results are low in reliability, and we need to improve the experiment. Okay. You are going to try out inter-rater reliability in class, so it's absolutely vital that you have a go at this event sampling now. So what I'd like you to do for event sampling, watch the video below, which is also linked to is linked in Moodle, so you can go back to the solar pack and click on the video. And I'd like to tally how many times you see or hear name calling, throwing, pushing, running away. And the same with time sampling. I would like you to hover your finger over the pause button, watch the timer count down 20 seconds. On 20 seconds, pause it and write what the child is doing. Press play, then let it run for 20 seconds until it's 40 seconds in total. Pause it, what is the child doing? Press play again, let it play for 20 seconds, pause it, and on that 60-second mark on the video, what is the child doing? And so on for all of those. Okay, so you can come out of this video, get the others, and complete that activity. And then we have types of observation. So these are event sampling and behavioural categories are all particular aspects of observation. These are six different types of observation. You've got overt, covert, participant, non-participant, controlled, and natural. Overt is obvious, so they know they are being observed. So overt, I remember O for over, O for obvious. They know they are being observed. Covert, you do things under cover, and you've got the word cover in there, so they are not aware that they are being observed. Participant is when the observer is taking part in the observation, so the observer takes part in the observation. Non-participant is when the observer sits back. So imagine the traditional observation. I'm sure you've all been in class when people have come in to observe, a teacher's come in to observe another teacher, and they've just sat in the corner and they've not participated. That would be non-participant. Participant would be when the experimenter takes part in the activity. So if it's a team building activity, making spaghetti towers out of spaghetti and marshmallows or whatever those some kind of team building activities are, they would get involved, they would be part of the team. Controlled is when the environment is controlled, so we alter something in the environment and we have control over that environment, and we're going to look at that in a minute. And natural means we just observe people in their natural setting. So controlled observation would maybe be if I change the seating plan and I observed your behaviours. Whereas, because I've altered, I'm in control of the environment. Whereas a natural would just be me observing you coming into class without me having changed your seating plan in any way and see what's happening. So controlled is where we have control over the behaviour and over the environment, and natural is where we don't have any control. What I want you to think about here is the difference between a controlled observation and an experiment. So as you all know, observations do not have an IV and a DV. Experiments have an IV and a DV. So what we're going to focus on here with experiments is, do they have an IV? So an IV is where you draw comparisons between two or more groups, isn't it? So caffeine and no caffeine, music and no music, 2 pints of lager, 5 pints of lager. So there are two conditions that we are comparing. In a controlled observation, all the experimenter has is they have control over the experiment. They don't compare one group with another, they just alter something about or control the environment in some way and then observe the behaviours of the participants. So I want you to, in your books, and if you turn over the page again, so you've just written down the descriptions of overt, covert, etc., etc. Now what you're going to do is circle each one of these scenarios and tell me whether it's controlled observation or an experiment. Experiment has an IV, we're comparing two groups. Controlled observation doesn't have an IV. We are not comparing one group, so we're just altering the environment in some way and observing how it affects behaviour. Which children display more aggressive behaviours? Those given plastic toy guns or those given fluffy bunnies? So we get children to come into a room, and then we give them either a toy gun or we give them a bunny, and then we observe their behaviours, and then we compare who was more aggressive, those who were given toy guns or those who were given fluffy bunnies. What do people do when a stranger invades their personal space? So imagine, I think this one took place in a lift, and we asked strangers to, every time somebody got into the lift, they would stand too close to them. So they'd be given a set distance, how close was too close, and we observed their behaviours. So every single person had somebody stand a bit too close to them, and we observed their behaviour. How many times do men make eye contact with those around them if the meeting is all female compared to men in an all male meeting? So we're comparing men in an all male all female meeting compared to men in an all male meeting, and how many times they make eye contact. How many flirting behaviours do teenagers display in conversation with someone they find attractive? So with this one, we would manufacture the environment so that person would meet someone that they would find very attractive, and then we observe how many flirting behaviours they display. How does the body language of someone watching stand-up comedy on TV alone differ from those watching it live surrounded by a crowd? So we would compare people who were watching, compare the behaviours of people watching TV on their own, and then we compare that with behaviours of people in a crowd watching the same stand-up, so when they'd actually gone to see the stand-up live. How many times does someone with autism mirror the body language of someone they are speaking to? So we would select and control the environment in some way. We would get somebody to go and speak with someone who is autistic, and we would just observe the body language of all the autistic people that we spoke to. So we would manufacture it, so somebody would go up to someone with autism and speak to them, and then we would observe that behaviour. And then, are there gender differences in responses to a puppy entering the room? So we would be comparing men and women, and we would take puppies into a man and puppies into a woman and compare the difference, see if people behaved differently. Okay, so they are all the different types. So can you identify whether it's controlled or experimental? And we'll go through that. Overt, covert, participant, non-participant, controlled, and natural. I'm going to name something, and I would like you to put into every column that it's appropriate. So every single one of these should be able to go in one column or another, or most of them go in most columns. Is it a strength or is it a weakness? So the fact that we're not relying on self-report. So self-report is where somebody fills in a questionnaire and says, I behave like this, or I would behave like this in this situation. We're not relying on self-report, we're not relying on self-awareness. Which one of those 6 would that be appropriate for? It's going to be more than one. Have a real think about it. So not relying on self-report would be one of the evaluation points. We're not relying on self-awareness, so therefore that increases the validity of the observation of the behaviour that we are observing, because we're observing actual behaviour rather than relying on somebody saying, oh, well, I'll probably do this. Observer bias or observer expectancy. So observer bias would be when the observer was biased towards one result or another. So if it was expecting, we thought boys were going to be more aggressive than girls, then they might purposely or accidentally tally more aggressive behaviours for boys. So it's the observer is biasing the information. And then observer expectancy. So what is the observer expecting to see? And this is a really good example of looking at aggressive behaviours in boys and girls. If a boy placed their hand on somebody's shoulder, or a girl did, because the observer is expecting to see boys are more aggressive, then he perceive that hand being placed on the shoulder maybe as a push or a shove, so he would tally it. Whereas if it was a girl, they would perceive that behaviour as affectionate maybe, so they would tally it as an affectionate behaviour, even though the behaviour was identical. It is what the observer is expecting. And then observer effect. So this one only applies as a strength to one type of study, and as a strength and a weakness to another type of observation. So either it reduces observer effect, so the person doesn't feel like they should change their behaviour because they don't know the observer is there, so they don't feel like they're going to change. So if you ever think about, have you ever stood in the street and suddenly thought, I feel like someone's watching me, act natural, and then you can't remember how acting natural is. That is exactly what observer effect is. We have an effect on someone just by standing and observing. So if you think about in lesson when someone comes in to observe the teacher, does everybody change the way they behave in one way or another? So obviously that's reduced in one study, whereas it's reduced in one type of observation where it's increased in another type of observation. So because the observer is present very clearly there, it can affect the way that we behave. You could extend that to another two types. So there are two types of observation where that one will be relevant, but it's also relevant as a strength and a weakness in another type. So it could be up to 4 times you use that either as a strength or a weakness. There are ethical issues, so participants need to be aware they're taking part. If they're not aware they're taking part, then that is an ethical issue. So that would be a strength of one because we deal with that ethical issue, they know they're taking part, and it'd be a weakness of another because we don't deal with it. A strength would be that of one of the observation types is they don't miss any information. So if they're working very closely with the other participants, they can observe it, they won't miss any behaviour because they're very close, they're right in the action. However, and again, so that would be a strength of one and a weakness of another. There is high and low internal validity, so some of them have really, really high internal validity because we have control over the whole environment, so we can reduce all the extraneous variables, whereas obviously in others we don't have control over the environment, so it's very, very difficult. We have very low internal validity, we can't control extraneous variables. However, a strength of one is that it has got high ecological validity. It's much more natural. We haven't manufactured anything. We haven't altered the behaviours anyway. So which one is that a strength of? Whereas it has very low ecological validity in another one because we've changed and altered the environment. So it's probably not so natural. So that any behaviours we see might not be representative of real life behaviours. And then there you go. How do these apply to each observation? Are they a strength or a weakness? So every single observation should probably have at least two strengths and 2 weaknesses in it. Think about the first 2 and where they go. They can be applied to a lot, if not all of them. So do have a look and have a think about that because they're more generic evaluation points. Okay, and that is it. Well done for completing the flip learning for observations.